tutti, io faccio un po' le veci di non so che, introduco il lavoro cioè questa presentazione di Andrew Keane, principalmente perché ormai insomma, è diventato quasi un appuntamento fisso, nel senso che abbiamo avviato insomma, questo tour di presentazioni del libro appunto Vertigine Digitale, grazie appunto alla collaborazione Egea, Michela Settimo, eccetera, così tanto per... dicevo, è iniziato tutto a Milano, alla Yulm, abbiamo fatto una prima presentazione, poi abbiamo portato Keane anche in Gruner Mondadori. Questa è una cosa interessante secondo me, perché c'è stato questo incontro, tra l'altro, in cui ha avuto molto successo la sua presentazione, e con i giornalisti e manager del gruppo, il che mi fa riflettere molto su una cosa che cioè un aspetto interessante di questa, diciamo, questo approccio neocritico allo studio dei media, dei digital media, ovvero il fatto che insomma può sparare a zero su diciamo, quelli che sono i pilastri fondamentali appunto della riflessione sui digital media e piacere principalmente poi a diciamo, pubblici di professionisti anche schierati in un certo senso ideologicamente. Non lo erano tutti, però insomma, perché insomma, secondo me dice qualcosa di molto interessante su quello che è il ruolo oggi di questo diciamo, approccio critico, dicevo, o neocritico. Principalmente di Keane mi interessa questa cosa appunto di cui discutevamo anche poc'anzi, insomma, con Roberto Grandi, con Vanico De Lupi, eccetera, ovvero questo suo riferirsi principalmente a cioè saltare a pie pari la questione dei francofortesi in un certo senso. Nel suo bagaglio di riferimenti c'è principalmente Arendt, l'altra volta parlammo dei francofortesi, ma lui preferisce principalmente Hannah Arendt, e invece di arrivare a quella che è il cuore di una filosofia che ha fondato in un certo senso diciamo, le democrazie occidentali moderne, il pensiero diciamo, utilitaristico e liberale, quindi Bentham, Mill e così via. Quindi in un certo senso piegare a strumento di critica ciò che era invece alla base insomma, della genesi dello sviluppo della società borghese, individualista e così via. Quindi su questo magari tornerà sicuramente Keane, insomma, toccando proprio i punti di frizione invece che appunto l'attuale sviluppo di queste tecnologie impone. Io chiuderei su questa, faremo la presentazione articolata più come forma diciamo, di intervista collettiva, mettiamola così, ovvero facciamo una domanda a testa. Quindi non so se chi vuole iniziare.
Tu che devi andare per primo.
Esatto, infatti. Vanni, quindi diciamo, commento, domanda suggestione.
Beh, il libro è sicuramente molto interessante e ho trovato che deve essere un libro che esce da un'esperienza statunitense, è un libro in realtà a metà tra, diciamo, credo, tra la cultura europea e la cultura americana, e questo appunto credo che sia anche un elemento di ricchezza del libro, appunto, che incrocia riferimenti culturali provenienti da ambiti diversi, incrocia una storia anche antica con quella che è la contemporaneità che tutti viviamo della rete e dei social media. Io condivido diciamo, in gran parte la visione critica di chi che credo oggi stia diventando predominante rispetto alla rete, no? Dopo una prima fase di infatuazione, oggi gli autori mettono in evidenza soprattutto gli aspetti critici dell'uso della rete, però quando i fenomeni sono così importanti, i fenomeni sociali sono così di grande portata come per esempio l'uso dei social media oggi, se 1 miliardo di persone più o meno è connesso a Facebook, noi sociologi siamo portati a chiederci le ragioni di questo fenomeno, di questo successo. Quindi Mark Zuckerberg sostiene che esiste un'unica identità, le persone hanno un'unica identità, mentre Kim contrappone l'idea di una molteplicità delle identità. L'identità è ricca, articolata e non può essere ridotta a un'unica identità. Però mi pare che questa cosa venga enunciata ma non molto sviluppata. Allora volevo chiedere cosa vuol dire che identità non può essere unica, monolitica come la intende Zuckerberg, ma molteplice. L'umanità, l'essere umano ha bisogno di una molteplicità. Noi diciamo da un po' di anni ci siamo abituati anche nel campo della psicologia a una corrente postmoderna della psicologia in cui gli psicologi postmoderni sostengono che esiste questa molteplicità di identità, l'individuo non soffre più della classica schizofrenia, no? Della moltiplicazione, della frammentazione di identità, ma riesce a fare convivere identità diverse. È così, oppure in realtà ha ragione Zuckerberg, tra virgolette, nel senso che c'è un'unica identità e ci sono tanti ruoli che noi nella vita quotidiana, nelle nostre esperienze attraversiamo, ma continuando ad avere un'unica identità che difendiamo, rispetto alla quale abbiamo delle linee di difesa, e qui mi rifaccio a Simmel, nel senso che appunto che è un autore citato da Keane, nel senso che Simmel appunto diceva che noi abbiamo bisogno nella realtà metropolitana, abbiamo bisogno di crearci una corazza difensiva, di difendere la nostra intimità, e quindi probabilmente possiamo dire che ci sono varie corazze difensive, ma come diceva sempre Simmel, l'individuo ha bisogno di creare un rapporto dialettico tra la sua identità, tra la sua personalità, tra la sua creatività personale e il bisogno di condividere con gli altri, di diventare social, di omologarsi agli altri, ma sempre all'interno appunto di una dialettica di questo tipo tra personalità, individualizzazione e omologazione, diventare uguale agli altri, annullare la propria personalità. Ha ancora ragione Simmel, che diceva queste cose più di un secolo fa, a sostenere questo bisogno umano di vivere in bilico tra queste due esigenze contrapposte? Questa è la mia domanda.
I think when it comes to identity, the important thing to bear in mind about all this is that we're increasingly, for better or worse, in the 21st, digital 21st century, our identities are bound up in our data. There's this excellent book by James Gleick, called, some of you may have read, called The Information, in which he argues that, I'm not sure how ironically he argues this, but he argues that we are data and that we've discovered we're data. So they've gone from the sort of the physical assumptions of what humans were like, you know, classically articulated by somebody like Thomas Hobbes, to this idea of representing human beings as data. Now, I'm not an epistemologist or philosopher, so it's hard for me to actually make a judgment on whether this is accurate. But what it's interesting is that identity in the 21st century will inevitably and unavoidably, for better or worse, be bound up in our data, in what people know about us, in how they perceive us, whether it's the market, whether it's governments, whether it's companies, whether it's networks. I think the most successful people will be those who manage their data effectively. So I always talk about something now called data literacy. I think in the university or school, data literacy is critical in terms of kids understanding how their data is used and abused. And of course, the great power in this world will be made up of people who have aggregated this data, companies or individuals. So the classic early powerful 21st century companies are Google and Facebook, which have aggregated a huge amount of our data. You can see this thirst, this appetite for data in Google's Glass initiative, in Facebook's obsession with getting us to give more and more of our own data onto their network. I think somebody, I quote it in my book, somebody said that data is the new oil. Which may be true, although the analogy or the metaphor is a little bit complicated, because oil just exists in the ground, and if you're lucky enough to have it under you, you become very rich. We all have data. It's not something that gets dug up. It's not something that spouts, you know. In some countries, Italy doesn't have much oil, Saudi Arabia has a lot. Every individual has data. And so it's less miraculous or less arbitrary, I think. When it comes to Zuckerberg, when Zuckerberg says you only have one identity, I don't think Zuckerberg was speaking as a sociologist or as a philosopher. What Zuckerberg meant was that I want to own that identity. So Facebook has developed something called Timeline, which seeks to become the narrative of your life. And Facebook's great goal, and I articulate this in the book, is to become the platform for Web 3.0 or for social media. I think it would be unarguable, at least in my mind, that we have more than one identity. We have many identities. We're different people when we deal with different situations, different networks, friends, family, workers, boyfriends, girlfriends, children, grandparents. We articulate different sides of ourselves. So I think this notion, I mean, I'm not a sociologist, so I can't comment on the academic side of this, but it seems self-evident, commonsensical to assume that we have multiple identities. Those multiple identities, of course, exist within us, so I guess in that sense we have just one body which incorporates all these identities. But sometimes those identities are contradictory, sometimes they don't always work together. My fear about identity in the digital social age is something I call digital narcissism, again, not a very original term. But narcissism has always existed. The problem, I think, in social media is it teases, it seduces us with the exhibitionist elements. It encourages us to believe that we're more important, more interesting, more relevant than we actually are. So we use this media to broadcast ourselves. And often I think we do ourselves an injustice. We embarrass ourselves, we shame ourselves. And much of social media is made up of content that's either shameful or inane. That doesn't mean that everyone who uses social media does it in a narcissistic way. But there does seem to be a very deep-seated element of narcissism in it. And there are a lot of psychologists and researchers in America who are finding this. I quote them in my book. I think in terms of, in a more optimistic sense, in a more positive, hopeful sense, what social media offers is the potential for a new kind of renaissance. A renaissance of the self in which we can really architect our identities appropriately in this age where we have so much new power for leaving our legacy. At the moment, I don't think that potential is mostly being realized, but I think there is a great deal of potential. I think young people in particular understand this more than the kind of the digital utopians who tend to be older and use digital media in a very confessional way. I think the opportunity for a renaissance is to use it in a creative way, using perhaps fictional narratives, basically lying, until we start using this media in a creative way to tell untruths about ourselves and not be so confessional. I don't think that renaissance will be realized. The problem, of course, is that the architecture of social media, of Web 3.0, is, I think, increasingly unfriendly towards lying. When you have devices that tell the world where you are, when you have this kind of this supposedly transparent reputational network, it becomes harder and harder to lie about where you are, where you've been, where you're going. So that's the, I would say that's the tension. We need to, since we're in a Catholic country, we need to make social media much less confessional, much more creative. We need to take it out of the church and put it into the streets. I'm not sure how easy that will be. And certainly the sort of the Puritanism, this new Puritanism, or digital Puritanism of Silicon Valley, articulated by self-interested people like Mark Zuckerberg, is antithetical to that kind of idea. I think it would be an interesting, for those of you in research, it might be an interesting comparison to see how the Renaissance reinvented the individual. As an American writer who wrote The Swerve, Stephen Greenblatt, he's an expert, an authority on the Reformation, very famous American writer. His book, The Swerve, won the Pulitzer Prize. Some of you may have read it. But his first book was about, I think, inventing identity or inventing individualism in the Renaissance. So that's an interesting book, and it's an interesting kind of...
Un primo punto riguarda l'economia dei media, che non nasce oggi, nasce con i media. Quando, diciamo, 35 anni fa scrissi un libro sulla radio e la televisione, quello che scrissi c'erano al tempo due possibilità. Il servizio pubblico, privo di pubblicità, ma con l'abbonamento. Se non vuoi pubblicità, paghi. Se vuoi gratuitamente la televisione vende il tuo profilo agli inserzionisti pubblicitari. Da questo punto di vista, oggi è la stessa cosa. Il costo dei social media deve essere ripagato da qualcuno. Ed è ripagato dai nostri profili. I social media vendono noi. Ecco, con un elemento nuovo, che è quello che viene rilevato nel libro, che consumare i social media significa diventare parte di una comunità. E quello che viene scritto nel testo, riassumendo, è che esiste una contraddizione tra il desiderio di appartenere a una comunità online e il desiderio invece di mantenere la propria libertà individuale, la propria autonomia versus questa appartenenza online, che significa, l'appartenenza online significa il massimo della trasparenza. In questa condizione la prima riflessione è: questa contraddizione gli individui forse non la sentono abbastanza. Forse un problema è che non c'è una grande consapevolezza che appartenere alla comunità online significa essere totalmente trasparenti con i rischi che questo comporta. Quindi io credo un primo aspetto sia il fatto che le persone siano consapevoli. Se uno è consapevole può decidere quello che vuole. Ecco, e poi invece la domanda specifica fa riferimento a quali sono le possibilità di contrapporsi a questa alle conseguenze negative della trasparenza totale. Da una parte c'è il diritto all'oblio, di cui in Europa si parla da parecchi anni, di cui anche la commissaria Reding parla, ed è una possibilità. Dall'altra, il fatto di poter, a questo punto, avere dei servizi che garantiscono la privacy e che sono a pagamento. Già tuttora ci sono. Terzo luogo, le tecniche che distruggono un certo tipo di dati dopo un certo tempo. Ecco, a me sembra interessante se potesse approfondire questi aspetti, partendo da un presupposto, che il presupposto sarebbe la coscienza delle persone di volere l'oblio, di volere non avere il massimo della trasparenza. E quindi chiudo con una piccola osservazione. Quello che si è domandato in tutti gli anni 80-90 era la trasparenza della pubblica amministrazione attraverso i nuovi media. La pubblica amministrazione deve essere trasparente. Quello che abbiamo ottenuto è che noi siamo trasparenti e le pubbliche amministrazioni e le imprese sono meno trasparenti.
I began, some of you may have read the book, some of you, hopefully you'll all have a chance to read it. I began the book in London when this whole issue of transparency, of radical transparency, is one of the central themes in the book, both literally and in metaphorical terms. I began the book in London, and the first couple of pages, or first 3 pages of my book, maybe I should have been slightly more explicit, but I make the point that cities, and I'm a huge fan of cities, for me they're the model of what we want to try to recreate in the digital world. I like the work, for example, of Jonathan Rayburn on Invisible Cities. Some of you may have read that book. But I'm in this city where I know the city very well, but I'm essentially anonymous. I have a right to anonymity in the city. No one knows where I am. I can go anywhere I want. No one's restricting anything. No one has any tabs on me. So for me, this is a kind of freedom, the anonymity of the city. And then I wander into where I used to go to university in London, and I wander to the tomb, the public tomb of the founder of utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham, his famous auto icon. Bentham left his body to mankind, left this body to mankind, and he wanted it to be displayed in University College London, and for the last 150 years it's been on public display. So you have this kind of transparency, this tomb, this corpse on display, and I wander in front of this corpse. And of course, like any social media person, some of you may have had this experience. Rather than have the full experience of looking at Bentham's tomb and dead body and all that, and just thinking about it, I wanted to tweet about it. So I get out my BlackBerry, my cell phone, my smartphone, and what happens is that the phone knows where I am. It's not particularly unique. Every time you get out the phone, they wanted to use location services to maybe serve up advertising or, I don't know, justify knowing where you are. So the contrast in the first in the first chapter in the book, there's a lot of other stuff in that first chapter, but the contrast is between this digital society that's emerging, where everybody knows where we are all the time, through location services, through our smartphone, through our willingness to share where we are on social networks, and the anonymity of the city. Doesn't mean that the city is always anonymous. So I don't know whether I understood what you were saying, but I don't think to be part of a community means that you have to be totally transparent. That's the fundamental kind of existential issue that we face now in terms of building a habitable digital world. I always use this quote from the fictional Sean Parker from the movie The Social Network, when he was selling his idea and partying at the same time with some young people. He said, first we lived in villages, then we lived in cities, then we lived on the internet. Now that's a kind of rather vulgarized Marxist Hegelian version perhaps of history, with the digital thrown in at the end. But I think there's some truth to that. And what I fear most of all are the futurists of Silicon Valley who are nostalgic for a non-existent past. Often when you meet these people who embrace this idea of transparency and you say to them, well, I don't want to live in a place where everyone knows where I am all the time. They say, well, it used to be like that. We used to live in villages and everyone knew where we were and our identities were fixed and we were happy. It's kind of Rousseau-like nostalgia or optimism for the past, which is always, I think I quote Walter Benjamin, who argues that futurist utopias are always inevitably bound up with some sort of nostalgia for the past. But the challenge, I think, the real challenge is not to go back to the village. McLuhan talked about the digital village. Mark Zuckerberg says he wants to build a well-lit dorm room that we can all live in, which for a 21-year-old kid maybe is attractive, but for anyone slightly older is much less attractive. And the challenge then is to build, because the fictional Sean Parker in The Social Network was right. We are increasingly living on the network. It's becoming the platform for 21st century life. It's how we derive our identities, it's how we do commerce, it's how we network, it's how we sell ourselves, it's how we buy services, it's how we invent and reinvent ourselves. So the challenge, I think, is to balance this transparency, which in some ways isn't a bad thing, especially when it comes to government, with the necessary dark spaces to maintain a degree of anonymity. I wrote my first book, The Cult of the Amateur, which I said that anonymity is a bad thing because it encourages lack of civility on the network and everyone behaves badly, is rude to one another. But I forgot to realize that there's only one thing worse than anonymity, and that's its complete absence. So I do think we need to teach the internet how to forget. At the moment, it's kind of inhuman. It's the platform for our life, but it doesn't know how to forget. And we may need some help from government, from people like Vivian Redding at the EU. We may need some help from the market with services, apps, products, even platforms of forgetting. There already is one. There's a popular photo sharing app which kind of destroys itself after a while. The only problem with that is my 15-year-old son told me that all the kids at his school are using it for sexting, which isn't such a good idea because, of course, nothing is ever inevitably forgettable. You can always take screenshots and keep the thing. So I think we need to be careful that we don't want to idealize forgetting either. There's some technology being developed at the University of Eindhoven in Holland, which enables the degeneration of data. But this question of forgetting is key to making a more habitable internet, one which isn't so radically transparent. I think we need to fight back again against the sort of these almost, I don't know how you would call them, these Puritans of Silicon Valley, who always say, well, I got nothing to hide. I'm happy to live in a transparent world. I had this debate with Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn, and my debate with him kind of forms one of the central narratives in the book. And Reid is a very good man. Maybe he doesn't have anything to hide. I certainly do. I don't want anything about me known. And I'm sure most of you have secrets that you'd rather keep to yourself. So I think we need to challenge this idea that we have nothing to hide. We need to demand that dark space, that mystery, that secrecy. And we need to do everything we can to insist that the architecture of the web is one as much of forgetting as remembering. And we need to be very fearful of these new devices and products that are now, it's kind of, I wrote my book 2 or 3 years ago, or a couple of years ago, but it's almost, the book now reads slightly archaically. I mean, when you think that Google Glass now has just come out, and there's this hysteria around Google Glass where you put these devices on, and they record everything you see. And there's going to be this massive boom in wearable computing. And of course, when they're developed from companies like Facebook and Google, their real focus is in hoovering up our data. So when you put on Google Glass, or when you go in a self-driving Google car, their goal is not to improve the world, their goal is to get our data, to make themselves more profitable. So this issue of forgetting, this issue of data transparency and of revealing everything about ourselves is going to become more and more acute over the next few years. It's certainly at the beginning rather than the end of the debate.
A me interessa molto dell'approccio di Keane, diciamo, questa varietà di riferimenti che secondo me lo caratterizzano come, diciamo, appunto un approccio continuista e non discontinuista. Voglio dire che, cioè, mentre molti studiosi appunto dell'innovazione digitale, i social media, fanno riferimento ad autori, appunto, diciamo, a un pensiero molto più recente, invece Keane va a rispolverare quelli che erano, ovvero, diciamo, i modelli di comprensione della società di massa, oppure la proiezione stessa, diciamo, della società di massa nelle distopie, in un certo senso. Faccio riferimento al panopticon, per esempio il Bentham, che io, diciamo, di solito ho utilizzato per spiegare altre cose e che, diciamo, difficilmente riesco a ricondurre poi diciamo, uno studio, a utilizzarlo come modello per studiare i social media, ma anche appunto Huxley, Orwell, eccetera, cioè tutto il filone distopico a cui Keane fa spesso riferimento, e a qualcuno forse più attuale, abbiamo detto anche l'altra volta, Huxley forse più dello stesso Orwell e così via, però anche questi, insomma, sono concetti, o meglio, sono racconti che, insomma, erano proiezione di una società diversa, un modello di tecnologia diverso, eccetera, e quindi applicarli al presente forse è meno, diciamo, convincente, anche se poi spiega bene Keane per quale motivo fa questa operazione. Molto più di questi, per esempio, è il modello della confessione, diciamo proprio la device della confessione di Foucault, che secondo me invece è veramente un punto di contatto fra diciamo, quelle che erano le forme di protagonismo e di ipervisibilità della vecchia diciamo, gestione broadcasting, mettiamola così, e invece appunto la dimensione new media. Quindi la confessione è davvero diciamo, un punto su cui mi trovo in assoluto accordo con Keane, e tra l'altro visto che, ci faccio riferimento a un saggetto che ho scritto qualche tempo fa, che era proprio metteva in collegamento la socialità attraverso i network con nuove forme di fascismo emozionale, no? Quindi un'idea che fa riferimento ad autori sempre in comune, per esempio Illuz e tutta la questione del capitalismo emozionale, che a un certo punto però si ribalta in una forma proprio di fascismo emozionale, nel senso che noi siamo totalmente pervasi e totalmente assoggettati alle nostre stesse emozioni liberate attraverso queste nuove piattaforme. Un'ultima cosa divertentissima per me è stata vedere come questi riferimenti, a partire da Hitchcock, passando anche poi per Zimmer, Benjamin, fino a appunto le altre cose che ho citato, Panoptico, fanno parte anche dell'armamentario del mio, diciamo, maestro e amico che è Alberto Abruzzese, Però la cosa che mi diverte è vedere come appunto questi stessi strumenti sono, cioè, ribaltati per cioè, in qualche modo proporre un pensiero totalmente diverso da quello di Alberto, no? Perché Abruzzese sappiamo che ha proposto in Italia diciamo, un nuovo punto di vista sui media che andava molto al di là, ben al di là, diciamo, delle posizioni della scuola di Francoforte, questo già a partire dalle forme estetiche e società di massa del 73. E invece qui troviamo gli stessi strumenti, diciamo, gli stessi riferimenti, eccetera, però ribaltati in un approccio, appunto, possiamo dire neocritico o anche, diciamo, estremamente critico, perché appunto è davvero un rullo compressore quello di Kim, che passa sopra i concetti fondamentali, diciamo, della nuova società digitale, mettiamola così. Quindi, detto tutto questo, mi manca forse la domanda. No, a me interessa questa questione del social, no? Della, diciamo, feticizzazione della categoria del social, che indica invece appunto un momento di scomparsa o di, diciamo, di weak social, perché invece no, di allentamento anche perché oggi appunto in una società appunto basata su questa nuova egemonia del social, i sociologi dovrebbero essere i padroni del mondo, invece insomma non vivono una particolare centralità, no? Diciamo all'interno. Esatto, perlomeno un ministro è riuscito. E quindi volevo appunto chiedere a Kim rispetto a questa, diciamo, dimensione del social che chiaramente alimentata è un po' quella che lo stesso Lofink pure diciamo, analizza come in collegamento con invece l'ossessione identitaria di cui parlava anche Codeluppi prima, e quindi mi interessava capire diciamo, se questa appunto feticizzazione è diciamo, più l'effetto di una, come del resto nella legge Zuckerberg introduce, di una diciamo, un tentativo di controllo algoritmico della società, oppure una rivalsa.
Having said that, though, I'm kind of intrigued by this way that you seem to think that I'm saying some things like it. I mean, I've always been interested, and I've never understood what Marx meant by fetishized, but since I'm a bit of a fetishist in other areas of my life, I use the word all the time without really understanding what it means. I mean, Marx meant it in a kind of metaphysical way, right? In Capital.
Yeah.
And he talked about the fetishization of capital in goods. And the other thing about the Marxist tradition is I do like especially Marx's way of turning everything upside down and showing the profound paradoxes at the heart of our political and economic life. And I think there is a profound paradox, and maybe this is what you're pushing towards, which I always wrestled with in the book, and I still think in some ways the book's a bit confused, because I never really figured this out. Maybe there'll be other books that figure it out more clearly. There are two things going on simultaneously in our world. The first is this profound economic, cultural, social, I don't mean social, this economic and cultural and perhaps political shift from the group to the individual. Now, this isn't obviously new. Durkheim wrote about anomie and atomization at the beginning of the 20th century. But there's something seems to be exaggerated, quickened about the breakup of the old groups, political parties, social class. And I think a lot of this has to do with the breakup of the old industrial economy. We don't work for companies for all our lives anymore. Many of us do different things. The challenge in this knowledge economy is invention and reinvention. Whatever you train to do in college, you're going to have to do something else later in your life. The storm of capitalism that Schumpeter wrote about so well in the 20th century is a typhoon, a tsunami. And whatever we do well will be destroyed by new waves of innovation. So if you want to talk about fetishization, perhaps the word that gets most fetishized in today's world is innovation. and disruption. And of course, behind innovation and disruption lies a lot of unemployment and human suffering and misunderstanding. This is an area I think I'm going to write more about in my new book. So the individual has been torn from the moorings of their traditional social life. For better or worse, some of it's good. I mean, and some of it offers great opportunity for enlightenment and emancipation and empowerment, all the big E words. And what's interesting about social media is it represents the platform for this new individualized life. The classic example is LinkedIn. You go on LinkedIn to network. You go on LinkedIn to meet new people. You go on LinkedIn to tell the world your resume and find new opportunities. Again, maybe this goes back to Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg. You only have one identity. Even Zuckerberg himself has more than one identity. He was a failed Harvard undergrad, then he came out west. And there's something peculiarly American, I think, about this world of invention and reinvention, which I like because I'm an immigrant to America and I'm continually in the business of invention and reinvention myself. I've been an academic, a failed entrepreneur, failed business person, now I'm sort of a failed writer, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Failure is also fetishized in this economy. If you haven't failed, you haven't won. It's hard to fail, though. That's one of the things that America needs to teach the rest of the world. But anyway, coming back to the central paradox. So we have a more and more individualized world, culture, and of course this technology enables this individualization. It allows us, it gives all individuals a broadcast platform, which historically only television networks or radio stations or newspapers had. Now we all have the power of a newspaper, of a radio station, of a movie studio. And we have these devices that allow us to do writing, filmmaking, music. And but the paradox, and I don't entirely understand the relationship between these two things. Marxists might be able to make more sense of it because Marxists are very good at making sense of things, even if they're usually wrong. The paradox is our fetishization of the social. So I don't think it's coincidental that just as we see the consequences of this radical fragmentation of individualization of life, so we've clung on to this idea of the social, or this ideal of the social, this ideal of sharing, this idea that we can have all these different communities. But I think when you look at it critically, what you see in the way in which people use these networks is they use it as individuals. And every community on Facebook or on any of these other networks are really just a reflection of ourselves. They're not genuinely social. One of the anecdotes in the book is I have a meeting with the Uber evangelist for social media in Silicon Valley, a guy called Robert Scoble. He's famous, at least in Silicon Valley. He has millions of followers on all these different networks, and he's always the guy who's evangelizing the new thing. I did a debate with him in Amsterdam last week about Google Glass. He spent the last 3 weeks going around with his Google Glass on. He even publicly said that he takes them into the men's toilet. I went to visit Scoble, and I went to his house in Half Moon Bay, which is just west of Silicon Valley. And it was one of these guarded estates, one of these enclosed estates, which is another paradox of a social media evangelist for openness. Many of these people live in these gated communities, which is hardly surprising. But when I went to visit him, I went to the wrong place. I went to the wrong house. And the man answered the door, and he said, I asked, is Robert Scoble there? He said, no, I don't know who he is, I'm sorry. So eventually I found his house, which was over the street. And I said to Scoble, well, don't you know your neighbors? I mean, how long have you lived here? How long has your neighbor lived here? He said, oh yeah, the guy's lived here 3 years and I've never met him. And I don't know anyone in this neighborhood. Because for me, I'm only interested in these people are older or they're military or I have nothing in common with them. For me, I only want community of people I share. So I have much more in common with a programmer in Beijing or an entrepreneur in Berlin or an investor in Bologna, to extend the B's in Bologna. And I think that this is the new kind of quote-unquote social on the web. Is that the social becomes an extension of ourselves. And it's deeply intolerant and troubling because, of course, the good thing about the physical social is we don't choose our neighbors. The good thing about the physical social is it makes us more open, more tolerant, because we have to deal with difference. But this so-called social that is emerging on the network is rather like the filter bubble that Eli Parisa describes in an excellent book, in political terms, is that we just go on the network, we just confirm what we already think. We just confirm what we think we already know. We just confirm our ideology. And the social is really just a mirror. And again, if you want to think in narcissistic terms, what we might think of is a new concept of social narcissism. So again, I think what the network needs to introduce or figure out a solution to is accidental neighbors. And I think that I'm not against the social. What I'm against is the concept, the way in which maybe the social's been fetishized on the network, and the way in which the reality of our world is one of weak individuals and weak social. I quote the New York sociologist Dalton Connolly, has written an interesting book in which he talks about a new concept that he calls intravigilism of the digital age, where individuals have no self, where they're continually defining themselves according to others and continually inventing and reinventing themselves. Well, not themselves, there. Maybe that's the wrong word. I think that strong communities are formed by strong individuals. But I don't see either of those on the network. I fear that we have increasingly weak, narcissistic, insecure individuals, fragmented individuals, and that the so-called communities that they're creating aren't real communities, and they're very weak and very fragile. Which may explain, by the way, and if you want to remember what Hannah Arendt said about totalitarianism and the way in which the conditions of totalitarianism depended on all the institutions between the individual and the state being destroyed. It may be one fear we have is in this world of radical individualism, where we're doing away with the institutions and the infrastructures of the traditional industrial age, and nothing is being replaced with them. In political terms, this may explain the success of movements like Grillo, who seem to be able to simultaneously take advantage and understand the individualized nature of contemporary life and our longing for the collective narcissism.
I watched your TV interview with Eugene Morozov about the American Digital Agenda, and we have the same process here in Bologna, and it is one of the key issues we are facing in this city, to promote awareness of what a digital skills needs, infrastructures, data, as citizens we need in this city. But you say in your interview with Morozov that a smart city is not always, and having a digital agenda is not always a good idea. I mean, there are also some fears that we should have about being so smart, so controlled, so watched, so tracked, so open in our data, in our profiles to a governmental control. So can you explain this concept? Can you tell us which are the fears that we should have about being smart citizen, not so smart citizens, but citizens
Smartified.
smartified.
An interview I did with Yevgeny Morozov, is another American writer and digital theorist, digital commentator. I mean, it was actually his rather than my concern, but I think I share his concern. I mean, maybe it goes back to the beginning of digital vertigo when I was wandering around London. This was an analog London, when maybe, you know, London is still dominated by cameras on every corner, so I don't want to idealize analog London. But I think the fear that Morozov has, which I share, is that smart cities are, which are greedy for data. Smart cities prioritize efficiency over privacy, prioritize this definition of efficiency, which I'm not sure many of us would necessarily want to live in that kind of world. It's no coincidence, perhaps, that I use the tomb of Jeremy Bentham and some of Bentham's ideas as the axis, the narrative for my book, because Bentham, of course, was the inventor of the panopticon, the industrial hospital or prison or school, designed so that we would all be watched, or we at least all thought we would be watched all the time. Michel Foucault, of course, uses this a lot in his work. Bentham thought this would be good, and he invented the concept while he was consulting for Catherine the Great of Russia, classic kind of enlightened despot, and the panopticon, I think, is a perfect weapon of enlightened despotism. This idea that if we thought we were being watched all the time, we would be more efficient. And of course, the whole notion of an intelligent city is based on efficiency. Now, some of those efficiencies I think are good. Traffic efficiency is a good thing. I do a lot of traveling around the world. I've been in Beijing recently, I've been in Sao Paulo, I've been in Los Angeles, and traffic is deeply debilitating. So I think technology that makes traffic more efficient, transportation more efficient, is a good thing. I'm not in favor of, you know, sitting in a car for 5 hours to go 500 meters. But I am concerned, I think, with the kind of civil liberties that will go out the window with this obsession with efficiency. And you mentioned and this might be a good way to explain where I'm coming from theoretically, although I'm not sure I'd use that word theoretically, I would say more philosophically. The counter to Bentham and this kind of utilitarianism, which is realizing a new digital form, I think people like Zuckerberg and Hoffman are classic utilitarians with a definition of human nature very much based on pleasure, simplified kind of algorithms of pleasure and pain. Bentham, theoretically, I think, would have loved the computer, which simplified and mathematicized our desires and interests. But the great critic of Bentham is John Stuart Mill, who began life as a acolyte of Mill. He was his godson, and Mill even invented the term utilitarian. Mill's father was James Mill, who was a good friend of Bentham and an early utilitarian too. But Mill in his early 20s, having been sort of intellectually engulfed in Bentham's ideas on who we are, had a nervous breakdown. And the consequence, perhaps the cause of that breakdown, was a reaction to that utilitarian understanding, simplified utilitarian understanding of who we are. And Mill's book on liberty, I think, in political terms, is a brilliant and a really it's probably the most influential 19th century political book, apart from the Communist Manifesto. Argues that we're more than just the sum of our appetites and desires. And that what really defines us and what drives society forward are people who are able to dissent and stand apart from the crowd and think for themselves. And I think the world that we are drifting sometimes unthinkingly in would be a world. This is why I begin the book with Bentham and kind of end it with Mill. It is a world where it will be harder and harder to stand apart from the crowd. And the nature of the internet, for all its, again, fetishization of openness and democracy and all the rest of it, is actually a place of conformity, dominated increasingly by a crowd. So in this future data world of smart cities and smart networks and smart devices, we do need to get beyond the algorithm of smartness and remind ourselves that human beings are more than just the sum of their parts, and that efficiency isn't necessarily the only goal of a good society, and that we need a world where people will be able to live independently of cameras, where they're not watched, where they're not continually evaluated by machines. Thank you very much.